Ukraine to receive uranium shells, possible consequences. On March 20th, the website of the British Parliament published information stating that the UK is prepared to send shells containing depleted uranium to Kyiv for its 28 Challenger 2 tanks, which the UK has decided to supply Ukraine. Russia's representative at the OSCE Forum in Vienna, Konstantin Gavrilov, stated that Moscow would consider the delivery of depleted uranium core shells to Ukraine as the use of dirty nuclear bombs. Finally, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a response to a possible supply of depleted uranium shells to Kyiv. According to the Russian leader, Russia has hundreds of thousands of such shells, but they've not been used yet. What are these shells that have resonated around the world, no less than the decision to supply NATO tanks to Ukraine? And is such a supply justified in terms of a possible escalation of the conflict? Let's look into it. The peak of the development of shells containing depleted uranium was in the post-war 1950s and 60s. During this time, experiments began with the use of cores made of the densest metals and alloys to increase the armor penetration of tank ammunition. At first, most of this type of ammunition was made of tungsten carbide instead of carbon steel. These were fine, except for two things. The first was the high price, and the second was that the tungsten subcaliber crowbar flattened at the end to form a mushroom as it pierced the armor, reducing the thickness of the pierced armor. Depleted uranium alloys are devoid of both of these disadvantages. They're cheaper and have the property of self-sharpening when penetrating a thick layer of armor, which increases armor penetration while saving taxpayers money. The emergence of multi-layer tank armor in the 1960s put an end to tungsten shells. In the 1970s, the development of tungsten carbide shells finally came to a standstill. American gunsmiths decided that something more effective was needed to guarantee the penetration of modern tanks. That's when the first uranium-titanium projectile was developed, tests of which showed that such a projectile hardly loses energy after firing and can penetrate serious armor without explosives. It's claimed that a projectile with a uranium core has 20% higher armor penetration than a projectile of the same caliber with a tungsten core. However, there is uranium in this projectile, and immediately the association with the atomic bomb arises. Can such a shell cause a nuclear explosion? Definitely not. An atomic bomb, like the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, uses the enriched uranium isotope 235, which is extracted from uranium-238. In other words, uranium-238 is first mined, and then uranium-235 is separated out of it using a very complicated technological process. It's not even theoretically possible to set off a nuclear chain reaction in uranium-238. And it's uranium-238 with uranium-235 removed from it that's used in these shells. Therefore, depleted uranium has even less radioactivity than natural uranium, so there's no risk of a nuclear explosion. However, the Russians argue that the use of such shells is equivalent to the use of a dirty nuclear bomb, which does not result in a nuclear explosion, but rather releases a large amount of radioactive substances that contaminate the area and make it uninhabitable. But is this true, or are the Russians intentionally exaggerating in the information war with the West? Let's begin with the regulatory documents. According to the 1980 Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, depleted uranium is classified as nuclear material of Category 2, and special rules apply to its storage and transportation. However, uranium projectiles are a relatively new weapon, and there are no UN documents that restrict or prohibit their use. Have uranium shells been used in practice? If so, what are the consequences of their use? Initially, the development of this type of ammunition in the West was aimed at large-scale encounters with Soviet tanks in Europe. It was assumed that several U.S. divisions with M1 Abrams tanks armed with such projectiles would be able to stop enemy tank armies from breaking through the Suwalki Corridor, a 40-mile stretch of the border between Poland and Lithuania. The two highways passing through this section are the only land corridor through which NATO troops can reinforce their troops in the Baltic states in case of conflict with Russia. In reality, the use of depleted uranium tank rounds was more modest than is often assumed. 120mm depleted uranium tank rounds were first used during the 1991 Gulf War in Operation Desert Storm. Later, they were used in Yugoslavia, and their peak use was in the U.S. military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. During those wars, these munitions proved to be highly effective at defeating conventional targets while halving ammunition consumption and causing critical damage to enemy equipment faster when firing at armored vehicles. In total, during these 3 military campaigns, the United States used about 2 million shells containing depleted uranium. This translates to about 400 tons of uranium left on the ground. The question remains, is it dangerous? In 2010, the British newspaper The Independent published a study by University of Ulster professor Chris Busby that said the impact on nature and the environment from the use of uranium munitions was worse than Hiroshima. While visiting 711 homes in El Fallujah and examining nearly 5,000 local residents, Busby documented a dramatic increase in cancer, which he said was only possible with severe mutagenic exposure. Another story by the Global Security Foundation claims that such effects could have been caused by uranium dust on the skin and mucous membranes. The problem of using depleted uranium projectiles proved to be unsolvable for those who use such weapons as well. The lethal aerosol penetrates the lungs of pilots, Bradley BMP gunners, and Abrams tank mechanics. It's reported that among this category of servicemen, there was an increased rate of cancer. So is NATO deliberately turning Ukraine into an uninhabitable zone? Not everything is that unambiguous. Firstly, all the studies mentioned above were conducted unofficially, and it's difficult to vouch for their accuracy. Secondly, international organizations do not consider depleted uranium munitions as chemical or nuclear weapons. For example, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research claims that depleted uranium does not meet the legal definition of nuclear, radioactive, toxic, chemical, or incendiary weapons, are not specifically designed to kill or injure with chemical or radioactive effects. Experts say that although uranium is highly toxic in its unenriched form, it's no more dangerous than mercury or arsenic. The key danger of such uranium is the dust emitted from the munitions that decay over time, which in theory could contaminate the area around or poison people. The World Health Organization states that the maximum dose of radioactive radiation that a person can ingest by inhaling particles of depleted uranium can increase the risk of leukemia by 2%. The UN Environment Program claims in its report that the use of uranium shells in Yugoslavia by the Americans had literally no effect on the environment or the population or the combatants. Italian environmental researchers who conducted soil sampling in Bosnia and Kosovo confirmed a slight increase in uranium content in the soil in the area of the fighting. However, the contamination values did not exceed permissible norms, and in general, it's impossible to speak of soil contamination. Moreover, London simply will not physically be able to supply large quantities of such munitions since they do not have them. Additionally, the Americans have officially refused to supply uranium core shells to Ukraine. Therefore, the Russians are greatly exaggerating the environmental danger from such shells in Ukraine. Is everyone calm now? And can we say that there are no radioactive territories in the center of Europe? However, not everything is so unequivocal. The Challenger 2 depleted uranium tank shells pose a serious challenge for the T-90 breakthrough tanks and in the long term the T-14 Armada tanks. While the risk of hitting these tanks with conventional ammunition was estimated to be low based on computer simulations, with depleted uranium ammunition, it's estimated to be critical. A hit on the target is guaranteed to result in armor penetration, not to mention the T-72 tanks. What are the Russians to do if their famous tank fist is destroyed? How will they stop the Ukrainian offensive? How will they defend Crimea, which they have long considered their own? The most dangerous side effect of supplying Ukraine with uranium core ammunition, in our opinion, is that it may lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And what do you think about London's supply of depleted uranium shells to Ukraine? Will this hasten the end of the war or, on the contrary, lead to a new round of escalation up to and including the use of nuclear weapons? Write about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give us a thumbs up so that more people can see it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss any new videos about modern weapons and their use in armed conflicts.